Alright, YouTube, I was slightly confused when people talked about the DPRK, North Korea, declaring war, because we've been at war with them since the Korean War began. You see, there was never an end to the Korean War. We're still technically in it. There was no peace deal achieved. There was a ceasefire issued, and the DMZ is sort of the don't cross this line, you'll get blown up or shot at area. That's really all that happened. We're still technically in the Korean War. I don't know why, by the way. You go to like the wiki for longest wars, and they don't actually put the Korean War there. They should. It's been going on for what, 6.5 decades or something like that, I believe now, or maybe 7 decades. We're talking about a period of time not that long after World War II that the United States and the South Korea and the Democratic side and the communists in North Korea were all sparring, and it was just a madhouse because the United States military was drained from World War II and fucked up. They hadn't yet updated much of their equipment to the point at which the North Koreans briefly had better equipment than the United States military had. They had been supplied with next generation systems by the Russians through the Chinese. We were still using, the Sherman tanks half the time, and things. It was just completely and utterly fucked up. It was a bloodbath on both sides. Hundreds of thousands were massacred. It was retarded, really, and then the Chinese Zerg rushed the border, which didn't help. You couldn't get too close to the Chinese border because then you had 100 million more communists to worry about than you were already shooting at. So it was a retarded war anyway. Really, part of the communism, the dominoes will fall sort of bullshit. But as for North Korea declaring war this time, I'm going to remind people again, they do this once or twice a year. That is, they put themselves into a wartime state. They say mysteriously, oh, a state of war exists between the North and South. The state of war exists between North Korea and the United States. A state of war exists between us and Russia because they backstabbed us on a rice deal or something. This happens often. I would like to point out perhaps one thing, though, that their minister there, I think his name is Han, said that actually is true. I actually can't find fault with this specific North Korean claim. I think the sword is double-edged, but they are technically right when they say this. They were pointing out the human rights abuses of the U.S. and its allies, and how they never get in any trouble for it. They're never condemned by the international community. Nothing bad happens to them, to this country or to, the UK or Israel or something for their own, limited scale genocide from time to time, certainly some ethnocide, ignoring the will of the people, disarming them, and then pumping their own nations full of immigrants that slaughter the native population, stuff like that. That is actually true. It's certainly true. The deck is stacked against those countries that don't get along with the U.S. and the rest of NATO. I mean, it's a simple truth. I may be comfortable with this fact because I happen to believe in representative democracy as opposed to juche sort of national communism. I don't support that system, so I don't really give a fuck. And you look at North Korea, there's certainly more than a small amount of human rights abuses going on in the DPRK when you've got so many people in secret prison camps being tortured, people getting raped as punishment. You don't have any access really for the average North Korean to the outside world. You have a handful of generals and top scientists and very rich sort of central investors, and then Kim himself and his inner circle. They're the only ones who really access the outside world. There aren't a whole lot of North Koreans with the money to travel anywhere. If they travel at all, it tends to be to China, which is also totalitarian and technically communistic. Although they are, a mixed model now. By the way, dear old Uncle Jang, who supposedly got eaten by a group of starving dogs or had his head blown off with an artillery cannon. I question whether that's true, by the way. I don't think that the execution was... I think they just shot him and dug up a ditch and buried him in it, personally. Took him out for a walk, and he knew what was coming, but he knew he couldn't do anything about it. So he's like, oh, yeah, I'll have one last bit of wine here, and then I'll go and get my head blown off by this fucking agent here, because I know that's what's going to happen. Dear old Uncle Jang tried to move the DPRK, the uncle of Kim Jong-un, towards a mixed model China style, which would have, by the way, the DPRK has so many rare earth minerals and so much coal, they would be fucking rich right now if they had actually taken up that kind of deal. Kim Jong-un, of course, though, I believe he has finally broken the leash that China had on him. that the North Koreans, now that they have atomic weapons, do believe that the Chinese are no longer a threat to them. I think that in their estimation, in their minds, the Chinese are not willing to potentially see one of their cities hit with even a small atomic weapon to overthrow Kim Jong-un or anything like that. And they may be right, by the way. I don't think the Chinese are going to take initiative at all unless they get a huge kickback from the Western world. I think they're potentially willing to deal with the problem, but then what's in it for them? A reunited Korea, a Korean peninsula under the leadership of what is essentially the government of South Korea would be a threat to China, in economic terms especially, because then all of a sudden you have a very densely populated, extremely literate, very developed South Korea absorbing essentially a large tract of agrarian land with more rare earth minerals than any other nation on the face of the earth, other than, I believe, Afghanistan and possibly Japan in some of the offshore deposits that are helpfully located close enough within the realm of what China claims is territorial water that they can't even really do much about it. They were going to literally sail ships over it, lower a vacuum system, and dredge up the sediment at the bottom. There are so many rare earth minerals in this deposit that it actually makes economic sense to just vacuum up all of the sediment on the bottom and not even bother doing any real refining until you get it back to shore. That's how rich the deposit is. North Korea's got the same general advantage. They've got an enormous pile of the same sorts of things that China needs to produce cheap electronic components. China loves that. China loves to buy them. If North Korea ended up on a mixed model, they'd probably be able to charge a little bit more because they wouldn't have slaves extracting it all. But the idea that they declared a state of war, now it's real, we're going to get atomically bombed or something, it's not going to happen. North Korea lacks the delivery system, for one. They lack miniaturization, number two. The Chinese would instantly nuke Pyongyang. By the way, I will say this. If the North Koreans actually attacked the US or South Korea or Japan with an atomic weapon, the Chinese would probably be the first ones to press the little red button and nuke Pyongyang off the face of the earth. Because the alternative is that the United States and its allies ass-rape the North Koreans and reunite the peninsula. The Chinese don't want that. So if push comes to shove, they'll be the ones expending their blood and manpower debilitating Kim Jong-un. Why? Because they want to install a mixed model style, communist light Chinese puppet regime. That's what they would do. And I don't think, by the way, that DC really gives a fuck. I also don't think that the average South Korean really at this point wants Korean reunification. They look at the difference between the two sides of the DMZ. The economic systems have been so different for so long that it's almost unthinkable that the South Korean population, even as literate and as economically advanced as South Korea is, would actually be able to pick up the slack and provide enough investment to even get it going without mass waves of potentially guerrilla warfare, for one thing. Right now, the North Koreans protect the South Korean border too, because nobody's crossing it. There are very few illegal immigrants into South Korea across the DMZ. That actually helps the South Koreans in a way, because otherwise they might get a million starving North Koreans begging for food and wanting the South Koreans to move in and develop things and bring them up to speed with the world. That would be like trying to bring Turkmenistan up to first world standards. It would be very difficult for even a major power to do, let alone the South Korean economy, which is large, which is very advanced. But you've got to realize it's not the U.S. It's not the size of the Chinese economy. They'd have difficulties actually funding all the infrastructure they'd need. Half the roads in North Korea are still like half-lane dirt paths. And people still literally use wagons and donkeys in most areas of North Korea. It is heavily agrarian. It is beyond third world in the generally understood sense. If you go to a nation like Ghana or Nigeria, you'll find 10 times the human development that you find anywhere in North Korea outside of Pyongyang, or a few of these other major centers of trade with China and or industry, which actually have, what you would consider a small but extant middle class, as well as an upper middle sort of investing class. And Kim Jong-un allows them to exist and have a little bit more freedom in exchange for most of the revenue as a kickback. He doesn't have a problem with that. Now, he's also not really a communist when you think about it. He's a nationalist, certainly, almost irrational nationalist. There's certainly socialism there. There's certainly central planning. But I'm not sure that the military first model of Juche really fits in strongly with the primordial Marxist model. I'm not sure that I think the perpetual wartime state being as it is has forced them into such a system. But at the same time, I mean, they should have known that was going to happen. The Chinese abandoned communism. They sort of stuck to this weird ideology that they have. They're living like it's still the Korean War. And they're not technically wrong. It's just by living in this constant wartime state, they're falling further and further behind. They've got manual artillery. They've got outdated, like 60s era Russian jets for the most part. Their atomic weapons are the sort of systems that the United States had in the mid-40s and the Russians obtained in the early 50s. So it's not exactly the most advanced military on the face of the earth. That being said, he'd have to massacre about half the population of North Korea anyway to reunite the peninsula. Because that's, the number of partisans who would take up arms, even if it's a little more than a wooden pole, and begin charging you. It'd be very difficult. I don't think people should underestimate their capabilities. But they're not capable of waging a protracted war. They're not capable of projecting their military at all beyond sub-warfare, which their subs are also kind of outdated. So no, this is just, they're pandering, trying to get attention. Every time the U.S. and South Korea are going to do joint war games in that region, the North Koreans say it will result in war. It's the worst provocation. And this time, of course, they put Kim Jong-un on, I can't remember, some sort of list of people whose accounts would be frozen and so forth. And they're mad about that. It's par for the course. North Korea is acting differently since they developed competent atomic technology. But at the same time, as far as that era goes, they're not acting any more abnormal than they have for the last decade or so, really. That's about all. Peace out.